Dr. Vanessa Harris walked into the small, dated courthouse with a quiet confidence that came from years of navigating the complexities of both her medical career and the challenges of being a black woman in a predominantly white field. Today, she wasn't wearing her surgeon's scrubs or lab coat, but her sharp, tailored suit and simple pearl earrings still conveyed the sense of professionalism she carried with her every day. She had just come from a conference where she had been a guest speaker on cutting-edge surgery techniques, but a minor traffic violation had brought her here. Judge Charles Montgomery sat at the front of the courtroom, a man in his early 50s, his dark suit stiff with authority. Known for his rigid adherence to the law, Montgomery had built a reputation for being unyielding, particularly when it came to minor violations. His expression was one of stern impartiality, a trait he prided himself on. Today, though, his posture was even more rigid than usual, his mind preoccupied with the morning's caseload. He had a long history of not tolerating excuses or leniency, especially in cases like this one. Dr. Harris stepped forward when her name was called. The judge barely glanced at her, his eyes skimming over the papers in front of him. She had been pulled over for a speeding ticket, a minor offense, but one that was undeniably hers. The officer had made the routine traffic stop and had written her up for driving 10 miles over the speed limit on the highway. It was a mistake, she'd admitted, as she had been distracted by the phone call she was trying to finish before the next meeting. She had apologized sincerely, understanding that the law had to be followed, but asking for leniency due to the circumstances. Judge Montgomery, however, didn't seem to be moved. He didn't look at her in the way someone might expect. He didn't seem to see the poised, respected surgeon standing before him, a woman who had spent years perfecting life-saving skills. He only saw the violation in front of him. His eyes lingered on her briefly, but there was no recognition. To him, she was just another driver who had broken the law. With a quick motion, he slid the paperwork to one side and turned back to face her, issuing a fine that was far steeper than one might expect for a simple speeding violation. Dr. Harris nodded, accepting the fine, though something in her chest tightened as she did. She didn't protest, didn't ask for leniency, and simply thanked the judge. But her composed response only seemed to irritate him further. She left the courtroom without a word, her thoughts already moving to the more important matters ahead, leaving behind a judge who felt he had just done his job. No more, no less. Neither of them had any idea how this brief moment would come to shape their futures. Later that afternoon, Judge Charles Montgomery sat in his chambers, sifting through a stack of papers, but his mind kept returning to the woman who had stood before him that morning. Dr. Vanessa Harris. He couldn't help but think there was something about her that didn't quite match the ordinary cases he usually handled. She hadn't been upset by the fine, nor had she tried to argue or reason with him. Most people would have tried to talk their way out of a ticket, especially for something like speeding. But Dr. Harris had accepted the penalty with an unsettling calm. Montgomery pushed the thought aside. It was just another case, another fine, he told himself. Still, there was something nagging at him, something that made him feel uneasy about the whole encounter. Maybe it was the way she had dressed, so poised and composed, standing tall in a way that was unlike most of the people who came through his courtroom. Maybe it was the quiet confidence she exuded, almost as if she belonged in a different world than the one he governed. A few hours later, as he was passing through the courthouse lobby, he overheard a conversation between two clerks. They were discussing an upcoming medical conference, and the name Dr. Vanessa Harris came up. Montgomery stopped in his tracks, his curiosity piqued. One of the clerks mentioned that Dr. Harris had been invited as a guest speaker at the conference due to her incredible work in the field of surgery, particularly for her groundbreaking research on surgical techniques that had saved lives all over the world. Montgomery felt his heart skip a beat. That name, could it be the same woman? He quickly excused himself and made his way back to his office. Without thinking, he pulled out his computer and searched for the name. What he found left him stunned. Dr. Vanessa Harris wasn't just a surgeon. She was one of the leading experts in her field, a pioneer whose work had changed the way medical professionals approached complex surgeries. She had performed surgeries on high-profile patients, and her innovations had been featured in major medical journals. Her achievements were staggering, far beyond what Montgomery could have imagined. His breath caught in his throat as he reread the article that detailed her most recent achievement, performing a life-saving operation that had never been attempted before, one that had earned her international recognition. How had I missed this? He thought. He had found a woman who, not only was she world-renowned, but she had been on the forefront of saving lives, while he had barely taken the time to recognize her when she stood before him. The realization hit Montgomery like a wave. His mind raced. What have I done? Judge Montgomery sat in his office, staring blankly at his computer screen. The realization of who Dr. Vanessa Harris really was, what she had accomplished, and the impact she had made in her field was beginning to sink in. The more he read about her, the worse he felt. The weight of his earlier actions pressed down on him. He had found her without a second thought, assuming she was just another driver caught in a routine violation. Yet she was anything but ordinary. She wasn't just a woman in a suit standing before him. She was a trailblazer in the medical world, a woman whose reputation extended far beyond the walls of his courtroom. He kept going back to that moment in the courtroom. He had seen her calm, collected demeanor, but he had interpreted it as indifference, perhaps even arrogance. It was so easy to assume she didn't care about the fine, that she was just another person who couldn't be bothered by a simple traffic ticket. But now, knowing her story, Montgomery couldn't help but think that maybe her composure wasn't indifference. It was grace. It was strength. The type of strength that comes from having earned a place at the table in spaces where few others look like you. Montgomery had spent his entire career priding himself on being a fair and impartial judge, someone who made decisions based strictly on the law. He had always considered himself above biases, and for the most part, he believed that his courtroom reflected that. He had never thought much about his own assumptions, never questioned whether his views had been influenced by the superficial, age, appearance, race, or background. Yet, in that moment, he began to realize the truth. He had made an assumption about Dr. Harris based entirely on how she looked and how she acted, without ever considering the depth of her life's work. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as guilt flooded him. What if his decision had been different? What if he had taken a moment to really listen, to look beyond the surface? He had acted on autopilot, focusing only on the ticket in front of him, not thinking about the person behind it. What kind of judge had he become? Montgomery had always been proud of his work, but now, with the weight of his mistake heavy on him, he wondered if he had been so caught up in the routine of his job that he had forgotten the human element. The idea that every person who stood before him had a story, had a life outside of the case at hand. He realized how easy it had been for him to judge Dr. Harris by a single moment, one that lasted only a few minutes in his courtroom, without ever considering who she truly was. The guilt didn't just sting. It made him question everything about his role in the justice system. Could he continue as a judge, knowing how quickly he had let his assumptions cloud his judgment? He knew he had to make things right. The days following Judge Montgomery's realization were filled with restless reflection. He couldn't shake the image of Dr. Vanessa Harris' calm, unflappable demeanor in the courtroom, and he found himself thinking about her more than he liked. His thoughts were torn between guilt over the fine he had imposed and a strange growing desire to make amends. But how could he? How could someone like him, someone who had spent years upholding the law, now find himself regretting the simple traffic ticket? It was a week later when Montgomery's chance for redemption came. He had just finished a long day of the courthouse and was making his way to the parking lot when he noticed Dr. Harris walking toward the front entrance. She looked striking, her professional attire flawless, and her confident stride unmistakable. For a moment, he froze. He hadn't expected to see her again, certainly not so soon. Dr. Harris wasn't here for a legal matter. She was, in fact, in town for a medical conference. She had been invited to give a lecture on her recent pioneering surgeries, and Montgomery had heard the buzz around it. She was a renowned figure in her field, and this was her chance to speak to other medical professionals, to share her groundbreaking work with a room full of experts. But to Montgomery, this wasn't just a chance encounter. It was an opportunity to do something he hadn't been able to shake off: apologize. The thought of seeing Dr. Harris again stirred up a mixture of unease and guilt within him, but there was something else too, a sense of responsibility, of needing to right the wrong he had done. Dr. Harris was just about to step into her car when Montgomery, almost without thinking, approached her. His heart was beating faster than usual, and he could hear the words in his mind before he even spoke them. But when he reached her, he realized that nothing he had planned could fully express how much he regretted his actions. "Dr. Harris," Montgomery said, clearing his throat, trying to steady his voice, "I hope you don't mind me interrupting, but I wanted to speak to you about something. I owe you an apology." She turned to face him, her expression one of polite curiosity, but there was no sign of surprise. Perhaps it wasn't the first time someone had approached her to express regret. Yet Montgomery was certain she didn't expect this. "I'm sorry for what happened in court," he continued, feeling the weight of every word. "I imposed a fine on you without truly considering who you are, what you've achieved, and for that I regret it deeply." Dr. Harris paused for a moment, her expression unreadable. She seemed to study him, as though weighing his sincerity. Finally, she gave a small nod, her voice calm but measured. "Thank you for saying that, Judge. I appreciate it." For a brief moment, Montgomery thought she might walk away. But instead, she looked at him, and in that moment, he realized how much more this encounter would mean for both of them than just a simple apology. Dr. Harris stood in front of Montgomery for a moment longer, her eyes steady, thoughtful. Montgomery felt a wave of self-consciousness wash over him, but there was no turning back now. He had come to this moment because he needed to make it right. The guilt that had been gnawing at him for the past week was now overwhelming. Yet, as Dr. Harris stood there, her composure intact, something told him that this wouldn't just be an apology. It could be a beginning of something more. She took a deep breath before responding, her voice calm but firm. "I appreciate your apology, Judge Montgomery. Honestly, it takes a lot to admit when you've made a mistake, and I'm grateful that you're willing to do that." Her words, though measured, held a warmth that surprised him. Montgomery had expected her to be angry or dismissive, but instead, she was accepting, even gracious. "I didn't expect an apology," she continued, "and I certainly didn't expect it here, of all places. But I think you should know that I don't take offense easily. What bothers me more than the fine itself is the assumption that I was just another person who could be dismissed, like any other case you see in that courtroom. It's easy for someone in your position to make judgments about people you don't know, but sometimes those judgments are based on things that don't matter." Montgomery listened, his face flushing slightly with the weight of her words. He had been too quick to make assumptions. The fine, while seemingly trivial, had symbolized a much larger issue. His failure to see Dr. Harris for who she truly was, a failure that spoke more to his own biases than to her actual behavior or character. "I didn't mean to underestimate you," Montgomery said, his voice sincere. "And I admit, I made that mistake. I thought I was just doing my job, but I didn't take the time to consider who you were as a person. I didn't even think to look up your name. I never saw beyond that moment in the courtroom, and that was wrong." Dr. Harris nodded slowly, her expression softening. "That's exactly what I mean," she said. "We often make quick judgments about people based on what we see or how they appear in a single moment. But that's rarely the full picture. I've spent my entire career fighting to be seen for more than just the color of my skin or the assumptions people make about me because of it. I've had to prove myself over and over again, not just as a doctor, but as a person." Montgomery felt the weight of her words sink in. He had never truly understood what it was like to walk through the world with a constant need to prove one's worth based on factors beyond control. He had been blinded by his own perspective, never considering the unique challenges Dr. Harris faced every day, challenges he couldn't even begin to imagine. I had no idea, he admitted quietly. That must have been incredibly difficult. Dr. Harris gave him a small, understanding smile. It is, but it's also why I'm not angry with you. I'm not angry about the fine. I'm angry that you, and so many others, don't see what it means to be constantly judged by the surface. It's exhausting. Montgomery nodded, feeling a knot of guilt twist in his stomach. But there was something else there too, a sense of humility, of being reminded that everyone carried their own battles, their own history. I'm sorry, Dr. Harris. I truly am, he said, and I appreciate your patience with me. For a brief moment, there was a pause, the two of them standing in quiet acknowledgement of the conversation they had just shared. Montgomery couldn't help but feel a shift inside himself, as though the ground beneath him had changed. He had apologized, yes, but more than that, he had been given a lesson he hadn't expected, one that would stay with him far longer than any courtroom ruling. Dr. Harris smiled again, but this time it was softer, warmer. Thank you for listening. That's all we can ask for, really. That people listen, and that they try to understand. And maybe, just maybe, we can start making some real changes. Montgomery, still taken aback by the depth of their exchange, gave a small nod. I'll do better, he promised. He wasn't sure what shape that promise would take yet, but in this moment, he knew it was the first step towards something much larger. The days that followed Judge Montgomery's conversation with Dr. Harris were unlike any he had experienced in years. He found himself replaying their exchange over and over, reflecting on every word she had spoken. Her perspective had been eye-opening, and for the first time in a long while, Montgomery began to see the deeper implications of his role as a judge, not just as a dispenser of the law, but as someone whose decisions affected people in ways he had never fully appreciated. The shift in his mindset wasn't immediate, but it was undeniable. Every time he interacted with someone in his courtroom, he found himself pausing, considering their story before making his judgment. He thought back to Dr. Harris's words, how easy it had been for him to overlook her achievements, to reduce her to a simple traffic violation, without thinking about the life she had built. He realized that this was a pattern in his life, one he had failed to recognize until now. Judging people by their appearance or their circumstances, instead of understanding the full story. One afternoon, Montgomery found himself in the courthouse lobby, grabbing a cup of coffee when he saw Dr. Harris again. She was walking through the building, likely to a meeting or a lecture related to the conference she had been attending. This time, he didn't hesitate. He made his way toward her, his heart quickening with anticipation. He wasn't sure why he was drawn to her again, but he felt compelled to speak. Dr. Harris, Montgomery said, his voice steady. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, and I just wanted to thank you again, for being so patient, for opening my eyes. Dr. Harris turned to him with a gentle smile. It's no problem, Judge. I've been there too. I understand that people don't always see the bigger picture right away. Montgomery nodded, still processing her words. You know, you mentioned something during our talk about how you've spent your whole career fighting to be seen for who you are, beyond the surface. I didn't realize how much I've overlooked that in my own work. It's easy to think that just because the law is black and white, everything else should be too. But I've learned there's always more beneath the surface, more that needs to be understood. Dr. Harris' expression softened, and she took a step closer. It's good that you're recognizing that, Judge. But it's not just about seeing people differently. It's about acting on what you see. We all carry a history, a story, and it's important to not let one moment, one mistake, define anyone. I understand that the law has its place, but we also need to consider the person standing before us. Montgomery felt the weight of her words, and for a moment, he wished he could turn back time and do things differently. Could it be that simple? He thought. Could it be that just by understanding a person's background, their journey, he could make more compassionate, more informed decisions in his courtroom? It was daunting, yet exhilarating at the same time. "Do you ever get tired of fighting that fight?" Montgomery asked, his voice tinged with empathy. Dr. Harris paused, considering the question before responding. "Yes, sometimes. It can feel exhausting to always have to prove yourself. But I don't see it as just a fight anymore. It's part of my journey. And if I can change one person's perspective, like I did with you, then it's worth it. We all have a responsibility to grow and to keep learning. It's never easy, but it's necessary." Montgomery nodded thoughtfully. For the first time in years, he felt as though he was starting to understand the complexities of human nature, of how important it was to see beyond the surface and recognize the full humanity in everyone. He had spent his career following the law. But now, he was beginning to see that there was another layer, the layer of understanding, empathy, and respect, that he had failed to consider. And he was determined to change that. As they parted ways, Montgomery felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't sure exactly what steps he would take yet, but one thing was certain. This encounter, this conversation with Dr. Harris, had shifted something deep inside him. And that change, however subtle, would influence every decision he made from now on. Judge Montgomery had spent much of his life believing that his decisions in the courtroom were solely based on the law, that his job was to apply justice with unwavering consistency. But after his conversation with Dr. Harris, something inside him had shifted. He found himself questioning the assumptions he had held for so long, reevaluating the way he approached each case. It wasn't enough anymore to simply follow the rules. He now understood that the human element, the deeper stories behind the people who stood before him, mattered just as much. In the weeks following their conversation, Montgomery took small but significant steps to change how he viewed his work. He began to take extra time with each case, considering not just the facts, but the person attached to them. He had always prided himself on fairness, but now he understood that fairness wasn't just about being impartial. It was about understanding the broader context, about recognizing that every individual had their own narrative that went beyond the confines of a legal document or a courtroom appearance. One morning, a case came before him that would test his newfound perspective. A young man, no older than 25, stood in front of him, charged with a series of minor drug offenses. The prosecutor painted a familiar picture, a troubled youth from a poor neighborhood, caught up in bad decisions. The defense attorney, a seasoned public defender, spoke of the young man's efforts to turn his life around, citing his recent enrollment in a job training program and his commitment to staying out of trouble. The case seemed straightforward, but Montgomery's gut told him there was more to the story. He leaned forward, looking at the young man more closely. He was wearing a neatly pressed shirt and pants, and his posture, though nervous, showed a kind of quiet dignity. Montgomery found himself wondering about this young man's life beyond the courtroom. What had brought him here? What were the circumstances that led him down this path? "Mr. Jackson," Montgomery said, addressing the defendant directly, "I want to hear from you. What's been going on in your life that led to this?" The young man looked up, his eyes wide with surprise, clearly not expecting the judge to ask him a personal question. He hesitated before speaking, his voice low but steady. I grew up in a neighborhood where you didn't have many choices, Your Honor. I didn't have much support at home. My dad left when I was young, and my mom did what she could, but she struggled. I got caught up in the wrong crowd, and I started making stupid decisions, but I don't want to be that person anymore. I'm trying to do better. I'm working, trying to stay clean. I don't want to go back to what I was." Montgomery listened intently, seeing the vulnerability in the young man's eyes. He could hear the sincerity in his voice, the desire for change. It was clear to Montgomery that this wasn't just another case. It was the story of someone who had been given few opportunities and had made some mistakes along the way, but was trying to find a way out. After a moment of contemplation, Montgomery nodded slowly. "I understand, Mr. Jackson, and I'm going to take that into account when making my decision. But know this, the choices you make from here on out will determine the rest of your story. You have the chance to change, and it's up to you to take it." He paused, looking at the young man with a renewed sense of compassion. "I'm going to offer you a diversion program, Mr. Jackson. If you complete the program successfully, I'll dismiss these charges. But if you slip up again, you'll face the full weight of the law. The ball is in your court." The young man's eyes filled with a mix of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Your Honor. I won't mess this up, I promise." As the young man left the courtroom, Montgomery couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction, not because he had handed down a lenient sentence, but because he had given someone a real chance, a chance to prove that they could rise above their circumstances and make better choices. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. Dr. Harris' words echoed in his mind. It's not just about seeing people differently. It's about acting on what you see. Montgomery had seen something in Mr. Jackson that others might have overlooked: the potential for change, the desire for a better life. And by acknowledging that, he had made a decision that not only upheld the law but also allowed for redemption. It was a balance he hadn't known existed before, but now, he was committed to finding it in every case he encountered. As he left the courthouse that evening, Montgomery felt a quiet sense of pride. It wasn't a pride born from following the law to the letter, but from the realization that justice wasn't just about rules. It was about understanding, empathy, and the belief that every person had the capacity to grow and change. The weeks that followed were transformative for Judge Montgomery. He found that the small but meaningful changes he had made in his approach to the bench were having a ripple effect, not only in his courtroom, but in the way he interacted with the world outside of it. He had always been a man of routine, of rigid structure, and of clear boundaries between right and wrong. But the conversation with Dr. Harris had taught him something invaluable. The true nature of justice wasn't just about applying the law. It was about understanding the human story behind every case, every defendant, and every decision. One afternoon, Montgomery sat in his office, sorting through paperwork when his assistant knocked on the door. "Judge Montgomery, there's a Dr. Vanessa Harris here to see you. She mentioned you two had spoken before. Is it a good time?" Montgomery's heart skipped a beat. It was the first time Dr. Harris had come to see him since their encounter in the parking lot. He stood up, smoothing the wrinkles in his suit, his mind racing. What could this be about? He knew she had been in town for a medical conference, but he hadn't expected to see her again so soon. "Of course, send her in," Montgomery said, trying to keep his voice steady. A moment later, Dr. Harris entered his office with the same composed demeanor that he had seen in the courtroom. She greeted him warmly, her smile genuine. "Judge Montgomery," she said, shaking his hand, "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "Not at all, Dr. Harris," Montgomery replied, gesturing for her to sit. "It's a pleasure to see you again. What brings you by?" Dr. Harris took the seat, her posture relaxed but attentive. "I wanted to thank you again for our conversation. It really gave me a lot to think about. And in turn, it got me thinking about something else, something that could potentially benefit both of us." Montgomery raised an eyebrow. "I'm intrigued. What did you have in mind?" "Well," Dr. Harris began, "I've been involved in several initiatives to bring greater awareness to the intersection of race, justice, and healthcare. As a surgeon, I've seen firsthand how systemic inequality can affect access to medical care, and it's made me more determined to address these issues head-on. But I also know that the legal system plays a huge role in shaping the outcomes for people in marginalized communities, and I think we need to find ways to bridge the gap between the medical field and the legal system." Montgomery listened intently, his curiosity piqued. He had never thought about the connection between his work and the challenges Dr. Harris faced in her field. But now, as she spoke, the pieces began to fall into place. "I'd like to invite you to collaborate with me on a project," Dr. Harris continued. "It's an initiative to create programs that address health disparities while also educating communities about their legal rights. I think there's a lot we can do to break down the barriers between these two systems, especially when it comes to underserved populations. I believe your unique perspective as a judge could really make a difference." Montgomery was taken aback. The idea was ambitious, but it resonated deeply with him. He had spent his entire career within the confines of the law, but now, with the perspective he had gained from Dr. Harris, he could see a way to use his position to effect real change beyond the courtroom. "I'd be honored to work with you, Dr. Harris," Montgomery said, his voice sincere. "I've spent so much of my life following the rules, applying justice in a very structured way. But I realize now that there are broader issues at play, issues that demand more than just legal decisions. I'd love to help in any way I can." Dr. Harris smiled, her eyes bright with hope. "I knew you'd be open to it. Together, I believe we can make a real difference. It's about time that people in positions like ours start working together to address the real problems people face every day." As Dr. Harris stood to leave, Montgomery felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. This wasn't just about fixing one mistake. It was about moving forward, about using his newfound understanding to shape a future where empathy and fairness were at the forefront of not just the legal system, but society as a whole. As Dr. Harris stepped out of his office, Montgomery sat back in his chair, a quiet excitement building within him. This partnership, this new path, wasn't just about changing his career. It was about changing lives. And he was ready.